It is Friday, March 3rd. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone. It's been another fairly busy week in the world of PlayStation, so first up, as always, our PS Plus reminder. The February PS Plus Essential Games are still live, but this is your last call. Claim those titles before they go away. March 7th, it's going to change over to Battlefield 2042 on PS4, PS5, Code Vein, and Minecraft Dungeons on PS4. Now, we already saw this lineup confirmed during the most recent State of Play, so not really a surprise here. And we do know what 5 PS Plus Extra games are going to be, but it's going to be a little bit longer of a wait until we know what the full lineup for Extra and Premium is going to be. Fingers crossed for more classic titles on Premium, more than 3 or 4 at a time. I know that sounds a bit greedy nowadays, but I would like at least 5 or more every month. And that's a good segue to our first story, which is The Legend of Dragoon was already patched on PSN. Both the PS4 and PS5 versions are fixed, or at least they're mostly fixed. So we talked about that last week where, it's a pretty well-known PS1 game, and it was cool to see it come back with trophies, but there were some soft locking issues on that game where if you use magic, it would, lock up, and also some weird audio problems cutting in and out. And so I'm surprised that they were able to patch it this quickly. Definitely something where I'm like, that might take, a few weeks, maybe a few months. But there is already a patch that fixes the soft locking issues. But there is some audio problems still from what I'm reading. I'm not playing the game right now, so I don't know what the exact behavior is, but it seems like if you use the in-game saving option and not the save states, then that should fix most problems, and you should have a simple playthrough from start to finish without any massive hiccups. So if you were waiting, then seems like now's a good time to jump in. But as I mentioned last week, there's an SIE employee on PSN Profiles that is collecting all these bug reports and forwarding them over to the appropriate teams at PlayStation. So it seems like they're really on top of it, which is good considering so far the program has been lackluster and disappointing, but I'm liking the energy and the response so far. Now, while we're talking in the context of classics, good segue to our next story, which is PS3 Firmware 4.90 is available right now to download. And let me tell you, I did not think we would have a PS3 firmware news story this week, or really this year for that matter, so that was surprising. Really thought 4.89 was probably it, but sure enough, 4.90, it's out there, and shockingly, the one changelog item officially is it improves the overall system performance. Now, what it really does is it has updated Blu-ray keys, which a lot of late lifecycle PS3 updates had updated Blu-ray keys, so I'm surprised that they're still doing that. But there's also apparently changes to the level 2 kernel, so if you're somebody that likes using custom firmware, then, kind of obvious, but you don't want to update just yet. Over on Twitter, Nathan Martin did confirm custom firmware 4.90 EvilNet is completed and tested, working as expected. So shouldn't be too long of a wait to have custom firmware 4.9 officially released and working. Moving on to our next story, Sony recently announced a brand new program called the PlayStation Playmakers, which is more or less their way of directly collaborating with well-known, globally recognized cultural icons in the entertainment space. So they could be entertainers, athletes, actors, artists, things like that. And the currently announced partners are people like LeBron James, Jimmy Allen, Nigel Sylvester, Nalissa Smith. There's a few others as well, but basically this does sound like it's a new marketing effort with well-known celebrities. And to kick things off, there's a new limited edition DualSense and PS5 console covers coming later this year that are designed by and inspired by LeBron James, and these will be available on PlayStation Direct again later this year in limited quantities. So interesting. Now, I will say I did not think our first, special edition PS5, and I say that in air quotes because they're doing what we all thought they would do, which is just do console covers. They don't have to obviously sell a special $400 or $500 PS5. If you want like a special console and you have to go out and buy a whole separate console, you don't have to do that. They can sell the console covers, which is good, but I did not think this is the first one we would get. I mean, we've had special DualSense colors like the Ragnarök one or Hogwarts Legacy. Cool, right? But, how does Ragnarök not get its own console covers? But then this does? I mean, no shade to LeBron James. I have no problem or qualms with the man, but that I'm kind of surprised by. But either way, I guess we'll keep watching this, and we'll bring it up again when the pre-orders go live, or when they at least tell people when pre-orders will go live and things like that. Anyway, moving on to our next news story, the Sony Interactive Entertainment head of third-party portfolio operations, Shawnee Benson, was recently speaking with GamesIndustry.biz, talking about her role and also how the company is approaching their third-party strategies as of right now and, well, during most of the PS5 cycle. A lot of insightful things being talked about here, so Benson explains exclusivity and generations prior played a role, but nowadays a big part of Sony's approach is evaluating how they can help the PS5 versions of these games really stand out. When talking about these games, she says, and I quote here, "What kind of innovation can they apply with the haptics in the DualSense or the adaptive triggers? What could they do with 3D audio and the sound design of a game, etc.? So there's a lot of things we could do and then create marketing stories around, and that's where some of these partnerships for multi-platform games really focus." And then when speaking on PSVR 2 and how the competitive model for that is different versus console, she says, and I quote, "We definitely are still in this rising tide helps all ships mindsets for the VR ecosystems. So it's not the same kind of competitive landscape as it is, say, in the console space, kind of flat gaming experience." There's more in there about their focus on supporting independent developers, the differences in the PS4 cycle to now with the relatively recent 2019 globalization shift, things like that. But, it's still it's cool to hear all these things in one go and having Sony be a bit more transparent on things that we've at the time speculated on over the years during LTPS, or even something as recent as the VR stuff, right? I mean, it was only a few weeks ago where I said, exclusivity is not nearly as important in the VR space right now when you kind of want every headset that comes out to be successful. That helps everybody for what is a very nascent niche market that's still trying to find, a big audience, right? And so it's good that Sony understands the priorities there, and really it works out for them anyway, because if they try and ship 10-something exclusive experiences, I mean, it's a lot of time and money for what is a small market. And I know you have to invest to, see returns out of it, but works better to just, support all the developers on other headsets, get their games over. And, but, we talked about that. Going into the exclusivity stuff, I mean, obviously Sony does a lot of third-party agreements to where it's either exclusive content or timed exclusivity, which, she doesn't really touch on here, but we certainly see what she's getting at when it comes to just trying to find ways to differentiate the software when you don't have those other items, right? So there's been plenty of, specialized trailers and blog posts for third-party games that do use those more sensory features of PS5, and that's kind of another topic that we touched on when the console initially launched. How do you make PS5 seem different and special when we have not only diminishing returns for visual fidelity, but also an industry where there's very few publishers that can even foot the bill for a AAA multi-million-dollar project that will push these consoles to the absolute max. There's very few publishers that can even do that. So at this point, if you want to really try and sell a console, you have to do something a little bit different, and that's why Sony went with these, sensory features like 3D audio, DualSense, haptics, and they can play into that for third-party games, and differentiate themselves from not only Xbox releases, but even PC as well. Although in that case, sometimes developers will support DualSense on PC, which is still pretty awesome. But always enlightening to hear Sony talk about these things. Now, going into our next story, we have what is a more impartial analysis of the current industry, which is from Ampere Analysis, which is a data firm. And recently they put out a new report for console games, console spend, the global spend overall. And right now there's been a pretty noticeable decline overall in 2022, where total sales for everything was about $56.2 billion, which that is a year-on-year decline of about 7.9%. But Sony apparently accounted for 45% of the market share for all money spent on console. Holding back the global spending was attributed to the supply chain issues for the new consoles, and at least for in-game spending, which was down 15%. That was likely due to the macroeconomics we're currently in, pre-pandemic spending behaviors, and also the cost of living rise. Ampere Analysis also expects the sales gap between PS5 and Series XS consoles to increase for the first 6 months of this year, and new Nintendo hardware should not be expected until the end of 2024. Now, I would agree for Nintendo's next hardware. I mean, I think most probably would agree that that's going to be sometime next year or kind of, I could see a reveal being Q1, Q2, and then it launches, Q4. But the point is, getting to the sales gap and the supply chain issues, I mean, that's really what was a problem last year. And, if Sony's driving 45-something% of overall console spend, that might explain why we're seeing a decline year over year, right? But it would be interesting to see how 2023 is going to pan out, because that is what we're seeing, is that the supply chain has caught up, but we're in kind of a weird spot, right? So I'm sure Sony's going to sell a ton of PS5s, and likely they could increase the sales gap. We'll still never really know exactly what the gap is going to be, because Microsoft does not disclose numbers, but they may sell a lot of consoles, but we are in like a really tough spot with the cost of living. Like, there's just no ignoring that, right? So consumer habits are definitely changing in a pretty big way. So it's not even something where, games are expensive, right? And it's expensive to buy a season pass or a video game on day one for $70. Like, that we can say that all day, every day, but it's hard to justify those things, even more so when everything else has gotten, I would say, substantially more expensive, right? Whether it's groceries, rent, you just get a house, mortgage rates are, really high, right? So it's just a lot of that at play as well. And those things kind of outweigh the importance when it comes to buying video games, right? So we might see less video games get purchased. We might see less in-game content get purchased. Subscription might be on the rise because you can get a lot of value out of subscription services, right? So, but it'll be interesting to see how this year ends overall. Next up, we have a pretty interesting record here being broken by God of War Ragnarök, where recently the BAFTA Game Award nominations were revealed, and Ragnarök secured 14 nominations, which is the most that has ever been seen for the BAFTA Game Awards since it was initially, since it started back in 2004. And that's kind of funny, given that Ragnarök has been on this trend of being a game that gets a lot of nominations. And we talked about this before all the Game of the Year awards went out, right? We were talking about how, there's multiple publications, and so I'm sure Ragnarök will win some, Elden Ring will win some, and you might have, Horizon win one or two of them, something like that. But really, we have the results now, and that Elden Ring undeniably won the most Game of the Year awards. Rightfully so, it's a great game. But it's funny that we've seen across a lot of places that Ragnarök will get nominated in a lot of categories and win a lot of them as well, but overall it's like Elden Ring wins, which is not the most bizarre thing in the world. It's just that Ragnarök can really exceed in a lot of different areas, but maybe as an overall experience and a game that may not resonate with nearly as many people as Elden Ring, that's why that would win Game of the Year. But, that's just, it's an interesting thing to think about. But looking at this, congrats to Santa Monica Studio. More awards are coming their way, I'm sure, from the BAFTA Game Awards. Now, moving on, we have a lot of news from Square Enix, and that's mostly because it's about Final Fantasy XVI, but before we talk about that, we have some news about Luminous Productions. Effective May 1st, they're being absorbed into Square Enix, which, more or less means as a subsidiary already that they're being disbanded or they're not really going to be a thing anymore. But it does seem like most of the team will probably get moved over to the other creative business units within Square. Although we can say Luminous already confirmed they're still working on a patch to address Forspoken's performance issues, and the DLC, which is planned for release this summer, is still coming and on track. But there you go for Luminous. It was, the writing was on the wall. I mean, and we can't really speak in a past tense here per se. Like, Forspoken just came out. It's still new. It's still full price. But, just one of those things where when you make the bulk of your sales right when the game does come out, you can already see, what it did and what its long-term potential is going to be. And it's probably not looking very good for that game. So Luminous, yeah, probably no more. But at least the talent is going to be retained, and likely they'll get moved over to more important projects. But it would have been nice to have them, find find some ground with this game and maybe have this sort of alternate timeline where they can start working on these new experimental projects for Square, but it seems like that's not going to happen. And really, in the grand scheme of things, I'm not sure if it matters too much because the talent is there and they can still do other things at the other CBUs. But also kind of up in the air what they're going to do with the Luminous engine as well, but I'm sure they'll eventually talk about that later. Now, going back to Final Fantasy XVI, this is where we can touch on the new press event that recently happened. So, folks got to fly in, play the game, provide some impressions, and that's where we learned a lot, especially because the producer and the director were talking a lot about the game. So, there's a lot that we learned, and what I'm going to do here is kind of a bullet point list of more pertinent items, new things that we learned, and some old stuff as well as kind of a roundabout recap of what we know about the game so far. So, starting off with the story, there's several different kingdoms that initially had this sort of alliance that eventually falls apart, and there's more there, of course, but we'll leave it at that for now. You'll play through portions of the protagonist's life named Clive. You'll see him through his early teens, 20s, and 30s. The game is not open world, but much like we're seeing with other linear titles, there's open areas that allow for a lot of exploration. So you'll have a hub area that you often return to, and then you can go explore previously visited ones. Some are smaller and some are massive. Optional areas aren't necessarily hidden or off the beaten path either, so the way Hiroshi Takai and Naoki Yoshida described this, it sounds like there's optional areas, but they refrained from calling these places hidden, like hidden dungeons or hidden maps. There's optional areas, but they're not really tucked away. The current build that was shown off has gotten a lot of praise for the technical presentation of it. It looks really good. And for the combat, which this kind of goes for the whole game where it has this feeling, but it's been heavily inspired by titles like God of War, The Witcher, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta. The action is very fast and precise, which, given the combat director Ryota Suzuki has worked on many action titles like DMC5, that adds up. And also we learned there's no difficulty settings, but there is optional items that you can equip that will act as accessibility features. So you could, say, turn on just an auto-dodging one, for example. There's also 11 hours of cinematics, and the press demo was 30 frames per second, but a performance option will be available at launch. And also there should be a playable demo on PSN that will be made available prior to launch. And then we also learned that the next news drop for the game will be sometime in April. This game is looking better and better the more that we see it. I mean, the press comments so far across the board were largely positive. A lot of good things being said about this game, and I'm glad. And I don't really know what it is about it that I'm so drawn to, because like I would kind of put myself in that camp of like a traditional Final Fantasy fan that likes the games for what they used to be, and will be, kind of getting into that in a story later on. But, it is something where like, and I'm not gonna front, like I like turn-based combat. I would all day, every day take a modern turn-based combat Final Fantasy, but we don't even have to sort of play into that because I'm fine with the action combat as well. But it's just, it seems to extend beyond that. There's so many more tonal shifts happening with this game. Obviously, it's rated M. They're going to be doing a lot of things in this game that they haven't done before. But I sort of like the presentation, the style, the story, everything that they're setting this game up for so far. I really don't know what it is, but it looks awesome. And I'm so on board for what they're trying to do with this game. Now, going back to what I said before about older Final Fantasies, and, it kind of goes into fan expectations, but that's our next story, which is during ScaleUp's preview of the game, which was a really good video, very insightful. I encourage anybody to watch that, but something where the producer, Naoki Yoshida, was talking about the term JRPG and how for them, that term, they don't really look at games as though they're making JRPGs. It's just them making RPGs, and that extends further to where they acknowledge that there's no negative connotations with how that term is used today, but years ago it was used in a more discriminatory manner, having JRPGs defined in such a way that there's expectations of what they should or shouldn't be, which in turn can feel limiting. So Yoshida says that for a lot of Japanese developers, they still remember how the term was used, and they don't really care much for it today. Really eye-opening to hear this, especially because I remember something like this happening years ago, and I can't recall exactly what the context was or who said what or how it came to be, but it was basically this, where the notion was brought forth that, hey, JRPG as a term is kind of antiquated, only the West use it because in Japan, for developers and players, like, they're just RPGs, right? They're just video games. They don't call them JRPGs with a set amount of characteristics that make them JRPGs. And so it's been so long, though, of course, right? So nowadays the term is something where most people are not using it in a mean or derogatory sense. It's just a subgenre with Western RPGs, ARPG, CRPG, right? Like, that's just how people use it, and it's so easy to, forget that. But when I was trying to look up the story that I was thinking about, and I still can't find it, but you find other stories about how, like, the genre and these games, like, they did kind of go through this period where, like, the press was being very hard on them because of, the very characteristics that, apparently define them as JRPG. And even me, I thought to myself, like, oh no, I just call them, I only call them JRPGs because if they're made in Japan. But even watching Skill Up's video, he mentions, like, oh well, you wouldn't call Elden Ring a JRPG, and I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. The game's made in Japan, but naturally I would not think to call it JRPG. So it certainly is a certain type of, a defined idea of what those games are supposed to be. And for Japanese developers, they feel that's a bit limiting that, purely the West use. But at least nowadays, most people are not using it in the way that the press was using it a few years ago. Now, for our final piece of Final Fantasy XVI news, again, the producer, Naoki Yoshida, was doing an interview with 4gamer.net, and this was recently translated by @Genki_JPN on Twitter, but he talked about the nature of their contract with SIE for the game's exclusivity, agreeing that, yes, for Sony, it's about selling their hardware, but it also extends beyond that for them. He says, and I quote here, "I think there is also that kind of intention on the hardware manufacturer's part. However, from our point of view, the technical support we receive from the hardware manufacturer is a big factor for signing such contracts. This time, there was a portion where we were developing together with SIE engineers who know the hardware thoroughly down to the core, and we received generous support and optimization that we could not manage on our own, and so on. Also, by not developing on the premise of multiple platforms, we could invest more man-hours into things such as building the game and optimization." Yoshida also makes a warning that while the agreement is 6 months, that doesn't mean they're going to get a PC version right up and out the door after 6 months. They're more or less implying that they'll probably need more time than that, but still nice to hear them speak very candidly about a topic like, contracts and exclusivity, which it's always a topic that is not, I don't know if misunderstood is the right way to put it, but, of course it's an exchange of money and marketing for a set amount of time of it only being on that platform, and so it kind of gets into an area that overlooks the benefits, but the benefits are there in that for a lot of devs, when they're only targeting one platform, it's not just easier, but like less stressful would maybe be the better way to say it. When you only have one platform, you know exactly what you're working with, what you're targeting, your constraints, exactly what you have to work with. And because of that, platform holders will come in and provide tailored support because that's the only thing that they're working on. And in the case of Final Fantasy, it's a very important franchise that Sony, we know, wants to get very close to. And so it's not really surprising that they're getting, I don't know if I would say it's preferential treatment, because they do this for a lot of studios that are targeting only their boxes. But, it's something to that degree where they want to make sure this game is looking as good as it possibly can on PS5, because it's a pretty big blockbuster release on PS5. Moving on to our latest update for the Microsoft ABK deal. So if you remember, we talked about how Microsoft subpoenaed Sony for basically internal documents and things that they can use to build their case when they go against the FTC, right, the administrative judge. And Sony was, of course, putting that back and trying to limit what they have to provide to Microsoft. And recently that order on motion of SIE was published, and it turns out a lot of what they were requesting was denied, but some parts were granted. So to surmise, Sony had 2 requests granted and 6 that were denied. A big one here was Sony's content licensing agreements. Microsoft wanted a copy of these going as far back as January 1st, 2012. But Sony will only have to produce ones from January 1st, 2019 onward. But in terms of trying to prevent this entirely, Yeah, that was rejected. They'll also have to produce relevant content deals that relate to exclusivity agreements with third parties, including ones that prevent publishers from putting their games on Xbox's subscription service. The other was Microsoft's request of performance reviews and evaluations of SIE CEO and other employees in leadership or management roles. Sony wanted this quashed, and it was granted. In terms of what else was denied was Jim Ryan's FTC declaration, custodian search, and custodian exclusions for Lin Tao and Hideaki Nishino. As a reminder, the FTC trial is set for August 2nd. I'm not really sure I would consider anything in here all that surprising, given that Sony has to play ball to some degree. I mean, if they're going to be considered in this entire anti-competitive, evaluation process because they are a big player and they could be harmed, then that means they have to produce documents. So, of course, they're going to try and not do that, but it's funny how they had very little way of defending this subpoena or trying to get it completely, stopped, because if you read the document, Sony's arguments for a lot of these were that it would just be too much of a burden. That's exactly what they said for a lot of these, is that yeah, these things might be relevant, but it's just we'd have to search through so many contracts. There's 60,000 of them, there's 150,000 of them, and some of it's in Japanese. It's just too much of a burden. We don't want to look for all these documents. You know what I mean? That's the best thing that they could really say in response to this. So, big surprise there. Now, I am seeing some say that, this means we get to find out what Sony has cooking for, exclusivity arrangements, because they have to reveal that stuff from 2019 onward. Anything they signed, with third parties, juicy contract details. Now, I wish we could see all those. I don't think we're going to. Unless it leaks, I think it's going to be something where it's like a sealed court document that's only for, attorneys and judges. So I don't think we're going to see that stuff. Maybe I'm wrong and I'm misunderstanding, but it's certainly a lot of confidential information. A lot of it could be redacted, but I don't expect we'll see a lot of it. If we do, that's cool. But yeah, I think there's nothing really in here that's shocking when Sony has to provide some documents that ultimately Microsoft is going to use to try to argue why they should be able to go through with this acquisition. Now, another big update, or I should say rumor, because this is coming from Reuters, which it's a report citing 3 sources with people familiar to the situation, claiming that Microsoft is now set to win their EU approval due to their recent contracts with rivals, which would have been Nintendo and Nvidia. And apparently they are going to be okay with behavioral remedies, and that they will have to possibly explore things that are going to alleviate concerns with other third parties, including Sony, but they're not going to force any kind of divestiture or something. It seems like they're feeling a lot more comfortable with the deal with those recent contracts. And as a reminder for this one, a decision needs to be made before April 25th in the EU. So there we go. We've now got a pretty big step in the process possibly coming, because again, it's a rumor. But, I always said, it's probably going to go through. And then there a little bit of doubt when, 3 big regulatory bodies were all hold on a second. But that was expected between all 3. So, but it's probably going to happen, especially because in the U.S., again, they feel very confident that, whether they, appease the administrative law judge or not, they'll let it go to federal court because they'll probably win that, right? So if they are feeling good about the EU, if they're going to be good with the U.S., then the U.K. is really going to be the last major hurdle. So we'll see with the CMA, and since they publish everything, I'm sure we'll be talking more about that fairly soon. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter, and if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it's very easy. You can follow the link down below. Supporting this channel in a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all. And our Thursday video, so just yesterday, was PSVR 2, Things You Should Know. One thing I'm seeing a lot is the expectations. Some people really love their PSVR 2. A lot of folks that maybe have very little VR experience are disappointed because they thought it was going to be something that it wasn't. So there's some tips in there. A few things you should really understand about what's normal in VR, what's not, so go check that out. That video was a bit late. I think moving forward, if there's no Tuesday video, it'll either come Wednesday or Thursday. I don't want to have to keep rushing some of these, so that just took a lot of different B-roll and things like that, but go check that video out, and we've got more PSVR 2 coverage and things like that coming up as well, but that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.